All right, everyone, welcome back. How's everyone doing? Good. Welcome to Constitutional Law. This is a good class, a packed class. I'm very excited. So first, I have a present for you. It's often said people make their impressions in the first minute, so I have something for you. Constitutions, okay? I'm going to give every one of you a constitution. You are required to bring it to class every day. Keep one in your pocket, wherever you want, right here, next to your heart, if you will. But keep one always close by. Today's class will be atypical in that I will not be calling on anyone, and there will be no questions. My goal, yeah, people are clapping, no, don't worry. My goal today is to take you on a journey through the founding documents of this country, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. I assigned you to read each of these documents in their entirety. Whether you have the textbook or not, I don't care, they're available online, so if we read them now, you have them in front of you. Most law students will graduate with ever reading the entire Constitution, let alone the Declaration, the Articles. You read them all on your first day of ConLaw. I need to move very quickly through this lecture to cover everything. I can do it in 2 hours. I've done it before. I'll do it again. My only question is, hold questions till the end. Come up afterwards. Ask me at next class, but I need to move fairly quickly. Now, it's a shame that most law students never actually read these documents. And it's an even greater shame that most law students don't come to law school with the knowledge of American history. Don't worry. I will not take this for granted. I will assume that you guys know nothing about American history, and I will teach you everything you need to learn. So I don't want people saying, oh, I don't know history. You will learn it. Because the story of our Constitution is a story of a republic that was founded in a crazy manner that no one thought could conceivably work. And 2 centuries later, we are still here, kicking around, debating what this little book means. So we start, as we ought to, on July 4th, 1776. Now, a little trivia. We celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, but the document was actually signed on July 2nd. But we'll put that aside for now. So what was going on in the 13 colonies in 1776? Well, people generally know so far that the King of England, King George III, was not being very good to the colonists. He was not treating them well, and the Americans were saying, wait a minute, this isn't fair. We want a representation. We want better treatment. And the King of England was not interested. They were servants. They were colonies under the king's rule. So in the summer of 1776, a group of men met in Philadelphia. And the purpose of this meeting wasn't entirely clear at the time. But they slowly coalesced around the idea that they had to declare their Declaration of Independence from England. Now, people don't understand what this means. They think, oh, great, you know, July 4th, we have hot dogs and fireworks. The people who signed this document were signing their death warrants. What do I mean by this? Declaring independence from the King of England was an act of treason. Every single person that openly signed their name to this document was basically saying, I may be executed. And it's often said, you can barely see it so faint, but the signature of John Hancock, why was it so big? He was telling King of England, come and take it, right? Come and get me. If I can put it in a little bit of Texan parlance. But among other things, the Declaration was a legal document. This wasn't just some sort of philosophical statement. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, 2 or 3 of which were attorneys. And at heart, it was a legal brief making a case to the world about why the colonies were justified in separating from the Union. So it begins, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Now, today we often think of the United States of America as one country, right? USA, USA. But that's not how they use the phrase. These were separate states that were united. Grammatically, you would say the United States of America are. The United States are together, not the United States is one nation. So these were 13 colonies with very different interests that united for the purpose, the sole purpose, of breaking away from England. Begins when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands. By the way, you have in front of you the Declaration. I want you to read along. Go, page 1. I'm serious. We will come back to throughout the semester. It starts on page 9. Read along. Mark it up, if you will. We'll be coming back to this the entire semester. Everything we'll cover is in this little book, believe it or not. The exam's open book, so you're welcome to bring this one in particular. Page 9. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them. This is like a breakup note, right? They were actually saying, here are the reasons why we need to dissolve these links to our mother country. Okay? And what do they do? To assume the powers of the earth, the separate equal station, their own nation, under the laws of nature and of nature's God. There's no UCC for revolution, right? There's no restatement second of how to break away. They were appealing to some sort of higher power, a natural law, or the law of nature, as it were, to compel the reason why, to impel, to force the separation. And this is the part that everyone always reads at barbecues, but people don't know what it actually means, right? I get chills every time I read it. It's been probably hundreds of times. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does this mean? For millennia, since the beginning of time, all of your rights came from the king. All of your rights came from the government. You had nothing unless the government gave it to you. The Enlightenment that inspired revolution said, rubbish. Our rights come from somewhere else. Our rights come from above. There is law above the king. We have these rights independent, and when the king deprives us of these rights, then damn straight we're going to do something about it. Indeed, governments are instituted among men. Why do we have governments? To secure these rights. We have government to secure rights of property, life, and liberty. And not just any king, some tyrannical despot. No, no, no. These governments are created by men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that the people decide the shape and form of their government, not some king in England. But what happens when the king becomes destructive of these ends, when the king no longer secures these natural rights? It becomes the right of the people to alter or abolish it and create new forms of government to affect their safety and happiness. This is Iraq, right? What's the issue? The king's being a jerk, right? What's the rule? The laws of nature. What happens when the king doesn't do it? We break away. This is a legal persuasion. And Jefferson wasn't just writing to the Americans. They were on board. This was a document sent to the world because the United States wanted to be on the world stage, a nation among equals. This was a declaration to the world saying, hey, we have a new party here. We have a new thing. Now, Jefferson makes clear, we don't break away for, quote, light and transient causes, right? We're not going to have a revolution every time people get upset over something trivial. But when you have a long train of abuses with absolute despotism, right? It is their right. It is their duty to throw off such government, that such a government cannot prevail. And Jefferson makes the point saying, listen, we've been suffering patiently. We've been waiting after repeated injury after another as an absolute tyranny has come over these states. So this isn't some sort of fickle decision we're arriving at. So the remainder of the Declaration lists about 30 grievances, like Festivus, right? You list your grievances. What exactly is the problem? One after another, let these facts be submitted to a candid world. Let the other nations of the world see, why are these colonists rebelling? Again, this was a death warrant. Every man who signed this was going to be hanged if the British won the war. And they knew this. So I'm going to walk you through most of these. But you'll see here glimmers of what will become the Bill of Rights, glimmers of what will become our Constitution. You see the shades, right? Many of the protections we have in our Constitution were designed to counteract the abuses of King George III. I don't know if any of you have seen the Broadway show Hamilton. I saw it over the break. I was the only person here who was booing when King George came on the stage, but I will live that up. So what did this tyrant King George do? He refused the assent to his laws. What does this mean? He forbid the states from passing any laws. He suspended their governments. So effectively, the states were unable to manage their own affairs. They had to rely on a foreign government to do everything. This is why we have in our system dual systems. You have a federal government and a state government, and state governments have power to make their own laws. Okay? He has called legislative bodies of distant places. You have to go to England to make decisions. He's dissolved these houses of representatives. He's refused to allow other people to be elected to these offices. He's prevented the population of the states. He actually blocked people from coming to the New World. You have all this land, and the king was controlling naturalization to limit immigration. He's refused to establish courts. This is a big one. And the courts are dependent on his will for the term of office. In our federal system, judges have life tenure. The president doesn't like them, too bad. In the king's world, if a judge rules against him, that judge loses his salary. Those are not very independent judges. He has erected offices and sent officers to harass our people. You had customs collectors searching for goods that were not being taxed. Do they need a search warrant? No. One of the reasons why we have a warrant requirement in our Constitution is because these British officers who had these writs of assistance could search wherever they want without any cause to search whatever they wanted. He's put the military under his control. In our system, the president is the commander-in-chief, but only Congress can declare war. Okay? He's quartered large troops. Now, people always say the Third Amendment is worthless, right? We don't want people quartering troops in our property. This was a big deal. Why was it a big deal? Because these troops weren't just bunking up in your room. They were watching you. They were seeing what you were up to and making sure that you don't do anything the king didn't want. Trial by jury. The jury trials were not held in the colonies. People were sent abroad to be tried by foreign juries. In our Constitution, the juries must be among your peers from the place you live in, not in far remote ways. The big one, one I remember, is taxation without representation. That the King of England and Parliament imposed taxes, yet the Americans had no say in what those taxes were. Okay, suspended legislatures, abdicated government, plundered our seas, and this one's an important one. At the very moment when the Declaration was signed, King George had sent armies of Hessian mercenaries, German mercenaries, to try to destroy the insurrection. So as Jefferson was writing this, armies were swarming towards the United States as the king was trying to put down the revolution. Okay. This is actually a surprisingly big one. The king would actually seize American merchants at sea and conscript them into the British army and force them to fight against their American brothers. This was actually a really surprisingly big deal. So Jefferson writes, in every stage, with all these grievances, we've petitioned for redress in humble terms. We've asked, King, stop this. Let our people go, right? Fix this problem. And with each injury, the king said, too bad. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which we may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people, for the rights of the people come not from the king, but from above. Jefferson also acknowledges that many of the British people perhaps sympathize with the colonies. In fact, the Americans were British. They were British citizens. They even speak the same language, have the same culture. We tell to our British brethren, we reminded them, we have a common kindred spirit, this connection, right? Guys, do something about this. And they have done nothing. So Jefferson says to his British friends, you know, in peace, guys, we're friends, but in war, we'll be enemies. This severed the tie of culture between these two civilizations. And then we get to the grand finale. We, therefore, the representatives, indeed, each of the colonies had sent members to Philadelphia to vote and decide, what the heck are we going to do? We, the representatives of the United States, appealing not to the King of England, but to the supreme judge of the world, God, if you will, right? For the rectitude of our intentions, in the name and authority of these good people, these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are free and independent states. Look what he did there, one sentence. They start off as colonies, and become free states. In one sentence, he tracked the transition from colonies to states. It's remarkable how quickly he did this, right? It takes us forever to write a tweet. He did it in one sentence. That they're absolved from their allegiances to the crown, and that all political connections are totally dissolved. So now what, right? We just broke our bonds. That's good. So what is it that free governments ought to do? This was the colonial charter. These were the things that the government can now do. Levy war. Oh, they're going to have to do that against the Brits real soon. Make peace. Make alliances. Establish commerce and trade. These are things which independent states ought to have right do. And Jefferson said, you know what? Now that we're a nation, we're going to do all these things also. And this was effectively the first government of the United States in 3 sentences. And in conclusion, they knew they were probably going to die. This is a cause worth dying for to them. They say, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This was their benediction, so to speak. They knew the 56 people who signed this. Here's a picture of it. The 56 people who signed this declaration, if you ever go to the National Archives, unfortunately the document's so faded, you can't even make it out, but it's there. And the people who signed this were willing to put their lives in the line to invest in an experiment that no one knew how it would happen. No one knew what happened after that. But this was the beginning, the charter that kicked everything off. The Revolutionary War was long and bloody. It wasn't resolved, depending on how you count, until 1781. So during those intervening 6 years, there was actually a government of the United States. They met in Philadelphia, they met in Trenton, New Jersey, they met in New York, they moved around a lot. And they were governed by a provisional document, a temporary document. Document is known as the Articles of Confederation. Maybe you may have heard about it, probably never studied any length, so I will discuss it with you. The goal of the Articles of Confederation was to provide a first attempt at the government. Now, it's very easy for us 200 years later to say, oh yeah, that was great. It'd be around for a couple of years and we'd have a constitution, right? But at the time, no one knew what would come next. We take for granted, I don't take this for granted, that the United States is perpetual, that it'll always be here, that the Constitution will always be here, that's always been here. This was not the case. During the first 6 years of American independence, they were busy fighting a war where at any moment, if it was a decisive defeat, the Brits would win, they'd have to surrender, all the people in government would be hung, and then this charter would be ripped up. So it's actually remarkable to think that while a war was ongoing, that people like Benjamin Franklin and others managed to draft any kind of government document that people agreed to. I have at the end, so the actual articles were written in 1778, so basically 2 years after independence. It was agreed by the final state, Maryland, in 1781. So basically for the first 5 years of our independence, we didn't really have a governing document. Only after we surrendered to the Brits surrendered to us at a Yorktown did Maryland sign on. So I want to walk you through this document as well. Okay. I liked how it's printed over here. You can actually see it much easier. To all whom, right? To all whom, what does that mean? To all whom these presents shall come, we, the undersigned delegates, send greetings. It was like a Hallmark card, right? We send greetings. The purpose of this document, much like the Declaration, was to send a message to the world saying, hey, we are a government here. Trade with us. make treaties with us, deal with us. And who authorized this government? Delegates of the states. The crux of the Articles of Confederation was that each state was a sovereign, separate government unto itself. Although there was a national government, it was extremely weak, and all the powers reside in the states. Indeed, it would be this deficiency that would lead in 1787 for a constitutional convention. They didn't know that yet, right? At the time, they were trying to fight the Brits. We have these Articles of Confederation and perpetual union. What does this mean, perpetual union? That will last forever? Oh, that didn't happen, did it? So this government began with a sincere and perhaps optimistic or naive hope that will last forever. Barely made it 6 years. So the style of the Confederacy, what's it going to be called? The United States of America. And again, this is not all the nations together. These are several states that are united. There's a very good semantic difference. Article 2 sets out the basis of this confederation. Each state has its sovereignty and freedom and independence and all of its powers, unless those powers are expressly delegated to the confederation. What does that mean? When the states declared independence from England, whatever power the king had in Maryland dissolved to Maryland. Whatever power the king had in Virginia went to the governor of Virginia. Each state retained the full police power, if you will, that they derived from England. The only powers the states lacked were those that they expressly give to the central government. This is an important point, because if a power is given to the central government, the states lack it. Okay. Article 3 says, the said states enter into a firm league of friendship. Firm league of friendship? What the heck is that? Doesn't sound very strict, does it? A league of friendship? Can you tell your friend what to do? Not really. You can ask him, but you can't tell him what to do. And this was a deficiency of the Articles. This was really about trust and respect, which dissolves very quickly when states have very, very different interests. Okay? Why do you have this league of friendship? Did everyone sign the sheet? Okay, good. And just when it's done, please bring it back up. Okay? What are they going to do? They come together for common defense, mutual welfare. So effectively, the only thing the central government was good for was self-defense from outside attacks. Everything else, each state decided for itself what to do. Okay? But at the same time, you see shades of an attempt to craft a national union. So for example, free inhabitants are entitled to something called privileges and immunities. These privileges and immunities is a type of a right or a liberty. In other words, if Virginia gives rights to certain free people, then Maryland has to give the same rights to those people. In other words, if I go from state to state, I should get all these freedoms. I have ingress and regress from all states. Now, the word free was not accidental. One of the biggest divides between the states, even in this early juncture, was over slavery. And it was understood at this convention that if there was any effort by the northern states which rejected slavery and the southern states which did not, the union would fall apart. So a compromise was made. We'll be talking more about these compromises to say this is limited to free inhabitants. Okay? And by the way, fugitives from justice, that generally meant runaway slaves who were also exempted from the from this protection. And this one makes it clear. If any person guilty of a felony flees from justice, a slave run away from Maryland to Pennsylvania, for example, he should be delivered or removed from the state by the governor. So it actually required the northern states to cooperate with the removal and return of slaves who had run away. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. Another clause which you'll see later in the class, full faith and credit. What happens if someone makes a contract in New York and they seek to enforce it in a New Jersey court? New Jersey can say, oh, that's a foreign contract. No, no, no. All credit will be given to foreign agreements and judicial proceedings in other states. This was an effort to try to build something of a national union, but it didn't quite work out. So there was a Congress, right? We think today of the Congress, you have the Senate, you have the House of Representatives based on population. No. The Congress of the Articles of Confederation had one house, and each state had one vote. So Virginia, biggest state in the Union, had one vote. Delaware, teeny tiny state, had one vote. You can imagine how that became problematic, how the states with the least population had the most control. And interestingly enough, the members of this Congress were actually sent by the states. And if a member in Congress was not obeying, they could be recalled. Bring them back. You're not voting how our state wants. We will put someone else in office. So the really idea was the people didn't have that much sovereignty. It was actually the state legislatures who decided who would go to the central government. Okay? As one vote. Okay? So Article 6 limits what the states can do. And basically the only thing the states could not do were things that affected foreign policy. For example, states could not send ambassadors. States could not enter into treaties with foreign nations without the consent of Congress. Why? There was a hope that at least the United States would speak with one voice to the rest of the world, not have 13 different fragmented voices. This didn't work out too well, as very quickly states negotiated treaties with foreign countries. Did not work out very well. Also said states can't tax goods entering the United States. They didn't want the states to start taxing. So if a ship pulls up into a harbor in Baltimore, can Maryland tax them? They wanted that to be a federal matter. That didn't work either. There's also a distinct concern about standing armies. We think today of the United States Army, the pride and joy of our military, right? But at the time of the founding, the idea was, wait a minute, if we're not in war, why do we need an army? That's dangerous. I don't want the king having all these troops around. Maybe he'll try and steal our liberty. So there are actual limitations saying that states could not keep vessels of war or any body of military forces during times of peace, unless there's an invasion, right? They did not want militaries to be just standing around doing nothing, because that's dangerous. If there's an attack, you raise the army, you muster the militia, and you get ready to go, but not without an act of war. Indeed, it says, no state shall engage in war without the consent of the United States. Virginia cannot declare war on France without Congress approving. Well, they perhaps may have at some point. One of the funnier parts by today's standards is pirates. This is actually a serious concern because pirates used to actually raid the shores. So actually one of the few reasons why the states could actually engage in naval action was if the state was infested by pirates. We'll come back to the pirates later. But this is actually a very big concern for our states. Didn't get it. Okay. There it is. Additionally, there were limitations on how war would be paid for. So what happens if Congress did agree to go to war? Who's going to pay for it? The expectation was that there'd be a common treasury, and the states would send money based on the value of their land. Now, I want to dwell on this for a moment. It was not based on population. Why do you think it was not based on population? Slavery. Because the South had a lot of people there. And they didn't want to have to pay more taxes based on the number of slaves. So instead of trying to navigate through that compromise, they based it on the amount of land. We'll come back to this later, the 3/5 clause. There's actually an important compromise that was made. But the idea was all the states would send money to Washington, or right, it wasn't Washington, it was Philadelphia at the time, and hopefully, there'll be enough money to fund war. Surprise, surprise, the states did not pay their taxes. Why? There was no enforcement mechanism. Congress asked the states, hey, give us this money. States said, screw off, and that was it. There was no mechanism. So basically, the country was going broke after a couple years. Indeed, throughout the American Revolution, George Washington was never able to give his troops enough funds and supplies because the Congress didn't have money to give them. That despite this revolutionary fervor, right, the states were being cheap and did not want to contribute to the national cause. Why? Oh, I don't want to give money. Let Virginia give money. Let Delaware give money. It's not my problem. You have these collective action problems. Okay. Article 9, again, says Congress has power over peace and war. Oh, these are cool. A letter of marque and reprisal is basically a license to be a pirate. And I'll give you an example. During war, Congress may give a private citizen or a private vessel a letter of marque and reprisal. It's actually a letter. It says, you can go here, kill whatever you want, and take whatever property you want to take care of the situation. Basically authorizes private citizens to become pirates. It's actually still in our Constitution. You'll see it later, but it doesn't happen very often. One item, remarkably, that was absent in the entire articles was a system of federal courts, a unified system of courts. You have the Supreme Court of Virginia, you have the Supreme Court of Delaware, but there was no court to unify them. The only types of courts were for trials of piracies. Why? Because it happens at the high seas and no state has any sort of jurisdiction over the pirates. Okay? The only sort of court was the United States Congress sitting as a whole. It could be used as a way to appeal certain judgments, but that, to my knowledge, has never actually happened. A lot of other stuff I don't care about. Okay. There we go. So, if you're getting the sense so far that there's very little that this Articles of Congress could actually do. Here's the things they can actually do. They can set the value of coin, and they can establish weights and measures. Not very weighty things. They can regulate trade with the Indians, but not regulate trade between the states. What states actually did was they erected commerce barriers. It would say, I don't want any Maryland goods. They're going to disrupt our markets. It actually blocked goods at the border. They can establish post offices. Yippee, right? Big deal. And not much else. And here's a trick question. So who was our first president? It was, George Washington. No. It was actually a guy named John Hanson who was selected president of the Articles of Confederation Congress. He served long before George Washington. The reason why we don't remember John Hanson is basically his office was worthless. He could do nothing. He had no power whatsoever. So he's quickly been forgotten into the ash of history unless they're on Jeopardy one day, in which case you'll know the answer that John Hanson was the first president of the United States. Okay? Here we have the key point. Congress can make requisitions from each state for taxes. Not binding. They can make requisitions. They can requisition like request, right? They can request the money. They can't guarantee it. Okay. So what does it take to actually go to war? 9 states, so 9 of the 13 must agree. Right? It's a big deal. Okay, I want to scroll down to the very end. Oh, this is the funny part. I don't know if there are any Canadians here, but they were actually so hungry for territory, they provided a fast track for Canada to enter the Union. Canada didn't take us up on it, so unfortunately, they stayed with the Brits, but that happens. Okay. So Article 13, we're almost to the Constitution, so don't worry, said that every state shall abide by the determination of Congress. What this was trying to get at was a notion that the law of Congress was sort of the supreme law of the land, that whatever Congress said goes. But people didn't comply with that. They also said the union shall be perpetual. Okay? What was the only way to change this union? Unanimous consent, right? Every state had to agree. So how many states were required to amend the Articles of Confederation? 13. All of the states were required to agree to amend the Constitution of the United States. Keep that in mind, because our Constitution, what we have, did not require unanimous consent. Okay? So the conclusion, again, appeals to this great governor of the world, this perpetual union to ratify these articles. And you know what he's saying? The union shall be perpetual. They were really scared. They were really trying to say with words that we want this thing to be around forever. We don't want to just win this war and then infight and become 13 separate countries and a colonist on a continent and then the British can just pick us off one by one. We want to stay together. And it was ratified in 1781 after the English independence. So I want to dwell on this last point for a second. This perpetual union where all of the states are required to agree to amend it. Throughout the 1780s, after victory was declared with England, the colonists, and now I guess the state governments, began to realize, wait a minute, this Article of Congress, it isn't working for us. There are some problems here. There's no money being sent to the central government. The states are doing whatever they want. They're imposing trade barriers between them. And our republic is falling apart. Our republic is crumbling. So a number of the states decided to send delegates to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And the purpose of this convention was to amend the Articles of Confederation, to amend them. But between May of 1787 and September of 1787, the people in that room who worked in absolute secrecy wrote a new form of government. The United States Constitution. When we study this Constitution, I want you to keep in mind the remarkable manner in which it was created. This was a document drafted in the span of 4 months. 4 months. That was agreed to by the majority of the states, not all of them, but was agreed to by the majority of the states. And this is a document that's been enduring for 2 centuries. No other government on the face of the earth has had a governmental document in effect for this long. Not one. Not one. So by divine providence or whatever, the product of this steamy Philadelphia summer of 1787 has endured long beyond anything that those who drafted could have possibly fathomed. Now, I'm not saying the document's perfect or it's flawless or that it doesn't need improvements or that it didn't need improvements. But the structure of the government they created has endured through times that many thought would not happen. So for the remaining, I guess, hour and change, I want to walk you all through the entire Constitution. And please follow along. It begins on page 17. Follow along, take notes. I won't, in this class, it's simply impossible for me to teach you every aspect of the Constitution. I wish I had an entire year. I can't, so we have 4 hours. So today is your overview. Today is your marathon race through. And then throughout the semester, we will come back to various points in the Constitution that I want you to learn about. So I want to start with the first 3 words of the Constitution, which I'm sure you've all read. But I want to compare the first 3 words of the Constitution with the introduction of the Articles of Confederation. So recall, the Articles of Confederation were based on the delegates of the states. Under the Articles, the sovereignty, the power of our union came from the states. The Constitution was a different ideal. The power did not come from the states. The power came from we the people. Whereas the Articles of Confederation were ratified by the state governments, the Constitution was ratified by the people in conventions of the states. This was a revolutionary ideal, that the people themselves could change the form of their government. That this wasn't just a bunch of people in Philadelphia slapping together a charter. That after the Constitution was ratified, the Constitution was sent to every state. And those states formed conventions. And the people debated it and voted on it. Indeed, you've also opened the Federalist Papers, right? The Federalist Papers were advertisements by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton saying, hey, people of New York, you should ratify this Constitution. As this document was being drafted, there was no guarantee it would be ratified. Indeed, the Constitution itself is illegal. How? Article said you need every state to agree. Constitution said you only need 3/4. The very document which we treasure did not comply with the Articles of Confederation. Now, eventually they got all the states to come around. Sooner or later, they had no choice, but the document itself said you need 3/4. So, we the people of the United States, not we the states, we the people. In order to form a perfect union, indeed, the union was not very perfect, still is not perfect. It becomes more perfect over time. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity and to our children and grandchildren. Again, there was no guarantee this Constitution would ever make it past 1790. None. But there was a hope that through this charter of government, they can create a system to perpetuate for posterity. And for these reasons, they established this Constitution for the United States of America, for the people. Now, the document itself is remarkable on a number of fronts. I've read it more times than I could probably even count. But what it does is it tries to structure a government that is most conducive, that is most able to promote the common defense and establish justice. One thing you'll notice about the Constitution, the one ratified in 1787, drafted in 1787, is that there was no Bill of Rights. Now, when you guys study the Constitution in undergraduate or high school, all you learn about is the Bill of Rights. Free speech, free religion, no warrants, no death penalty, all this other stuff, right? The original Constitution had no Bill of Rights. There was no protection of individual rights, with limited exception in the Constitution. Why? The framers were of the mindset that simply listing rights is worthless. Let me one day show you the Soviet Union's Constitution. It was awesome. You have a right to housing and right to education and right to free speech. Do they worship, do they respect any of it? Of course not. What protects freedom is not some sort of piece of paper, but it's the structure of government that puts teeth and lets one branch of government check another to ensure that liberties are not eroded. That was a design of our Constitution. Not to blanket protect whatever rights you can make up, religion, speech, whatever, right? It created the structure of a government. You notice the Articles had no structure. You had one Congress with these one votes and did nothing. The balance of our Constitution is to structure and separate the powers. The phrase separation of powers is not some sort of slogan on a bumper sticker that you'll see on a pickup truck, right? These are real designs meant to protect our freedoms. So the very first article, Article 1, Section 1, all legislative powers. The system of our government was designed to separate powers. You had a legislative branch, legislative powers, you had an executive branch, executive powers, you had a judicial branch with judicial powers. The first three articles of our Constitution, Article 1, legislative powers, write this down. Article 1, legislative powers. Article 2, executive powers. Article 3, judicial powers. The first three articles of our Constitution were designed to separate the powers before doing anything else. Before we get to free speech or whatever other stuff that you want to do, separating the powers in the spirit of the Enlightenment, people like Montesquieu and others, this was the core of how our government was to be structured. All legislative powers are vested in a Congress of the United States. And this Congress will have two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. This was based roughly on the British model. We had a House of Lords and a House of Commons in Parliament. Section 2. It's very, very methodical, very logical. The House of Representatives has members elected by the people. Not the state, but by the people. Every 2 years. Okay? You can't run for Congress unless you're a citizen of the United States for 7 years. And, oh, by the way, you're 25 years old. So if any of you are under 25, you can't run for Congress yet. Although when you turn 25, celebrate your constitutional birthday. It's a big deal. I've had 2 so far. I haven't had my 3rd one quite yet. I'll explain why. This clause, big deal. So whereas the Articles of Confederation did not have any method of collecting taxes, here, rather than imposing taxes on the states, they would impose taxes directly on people. And it's a lot easier to collect money from an individual than it is from a state government. Now, they say, wait a minute, we don't want that central government taxing us. This was part of the compromise. They realized the Articles were not functioning. Okay? Now, how are taxes apportioned or calculated? Okay? And this is the so-called 3/5 clause, right? I want to dwell on this for a second because this is something that people don't understand. Population has 2 elements, say. So the more people a state has, the more members of Congress it gets. So for example, Virginia was the biggest state. They'd have a lot of members of Congress. I think they had 10. And Delaware is like a little, pitsy state, 1 member of Congress. Okay. The southern states, the reason why their population was so large was because of slaves. In fact, I've seen the numbers in some states, virtually half their population was slaves. So what happens if we exclude slaves from the count of people? The South would lose representation, right? Virginia would not be much bigger than Pennsylvania. So the Southerners had an interest in having their slaves count for purposes of representation, okay? But taxation is based on the number of people. Did Virginia want to have to pay taxes based on all of its slaves? Of course not. So the compromise was thus struck. For purposes of both taxation and representation, slaves were counted at 3/5. Imagine what would have happened if slaves were counted at 100% for both taxation and representation. The South would have had much more control in Congress. Had slaves been counted at 100%, the South would have had more control in Congress. Would those slaves been able to vote? Of course not. Had the South had the supermajority in Congress, the slave trade would have never been repealed. Had the South had a supermajority in Congress, you would have never been able to elect a president, Abraham Lincoln, who was opposed to slavery. I want you to think about this for a second. People don't understand the 3/5 clause because they don't get what it means. Yes, it's horrible that people consider it a fraction, but the alternative would have been actually worse. Had the South counted blacks at 100%, we would have never had Abraham Lincoln as president. We would have had a permanent majority of slavery in the South. And the people drafting that clause knew this. They can look at demographics. They can look at how population grows. So the 3/5 compromise was actually from the North. The Southern states wanted all the people to be counted for purpose of representation. It was the Northern abolition states that no, that's going to be too difficult. So it was struck at 3/5. It was funny, a number of years ago, I think in 2010, the Congress decided to read the entire Constitution cover to cover. No one wanted to read this clause. No one wanted to read it. No one wanted to be on C-SPAN reading this clause. They don't understand actually what it means, but it is a jarring thought. But at least now you know the history of how this was designed. We'll come back to this phrase in a little bit. Okay. Congress divvied up members of Congress. Okay, 1 second. Okay. And we're still in Article 1. Article 1 is all the congressional powers. Okay, what's this? Power of impeachment. So what happens if the president misbehaves? What happens if a judge misbehaves? What happens if the Secretary of State misbehaves? Do we have a coup? Do we have a revolution? Do we kill him? No. The people indirectly have the capability of removing the president without putting a noose around his neck, as happens in other countries. The House of Representatives can vote to impeach. Now, people don't actually get this. There's a two-step process for removing a president. First, a majority of the House votes to impeach. You can write this down, guys. First, a majority of the House votes to impeach. All right? When I start numbering stuff, that means you should write it down. Hint. Second, the Senate holds a trial that actually becomes a court. And 2/3 of the Senate must vote to remove. So removing a person from office is very difficult. It requires a majority of Congress and 2/3 of the Senate, supermajority. At every single juncture, as you'll see in this class, power is divided up. No one person can remove a president. No one person can elect a president. No one president can do whatever he wants. At every structure, power is divided. We move to Article 1, Section 3, which defines the Senate. Now, this is one area where our Congress has changed significantly. Today, all of you in 2016, hopefully you will go vote, and you can vote for senator. Actually, I don't think it was up this term. But in theory, you can vote for senator in Texas, wherever you live. Under the original Constitution, the people did not vote for senators. While they voted for the House of Representatives, the state legislatures chose the senators. This was changed by the 17th Amendment much later. But the idea was that one branch of Congress should be responsive, not just to the people, but to the needs of the states. This was, again, a check on the people themselves and government, spread out the authority. Okay? Qualification for senator. This is your second constitutional birthday when you turn 30 years old. Now, what's this? A vice president of the United States. The government structure we have decided that there was something called a president. This was a position that really didn't have much of a precedent, no pun intended. And then the president has a understudy, a vice president, if you will. Okay? One of the vice president's few jobs is if there's a tie in the Senate, he casts a tie-breaking vote. We will discuss a case in about 2 weeks where exactly this happened. We get down to the, the powers of the Senate. And among the powers of the Senate are trying cases of impeachment. Indeed, if the president's ever impeached, the Chief Justice shall preside at the trial. So when President Clinton was impeached in the 90s, William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice, actually sat and presided. Now, wait, who's this Chief Justice? Where did this come from? We have a system of courts. You see the document layers one on top of the other. To remove the president, you need a majority of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and the Chief Justice of the United States to preside over that hearing to make sure everything's comported properly. Power is divided in every conceivable manner. Right? You'll hear this phrase from me more times than I can probably count. Okay, go down. So what about elections? The states get to decide when elections are held, but the House and the Senate can judge their own elections. So the House cannot be required to seat someone that the majority does not want to seat. Okay. This is an important one that people probably don't care much about. My computer's going to slow today. Neither house can adjourn without the consent of the other house. Why is this important? Well, imagine the House of Representatives doesn't like the Senate. Okay? And the Senate really wants to pass a bill. And the House says, you know what? We're just going to call it quits and go home for the summer. Bill never gets passed. Both houses have to agree to adjourn to ensure that the branches can actually work together. It's a remarkable check. I mean, you don't think much about it. But in England, the king had the power to dissolve Parliament. He could simply tell Parliament, you know what, you guys, you're making annoying laws. Go home. Come back next year. and the king could do whatever he wanted. We do not have that. The houses have to stay with consent of the others. Okay? Who pays the salary of these members of Congress? Not the states. Under the Articles, the states pay their salaries. Here, the Treasury of the United States pays it. That way, the members of Congress are not dependent on their states, but have an independent source of authority. This clause people don't think much about, but we didn't have Washington, D.C., a federal capital. For many years, the capital was in New York or Philadelphia. Those are states with their own governments. And what happens if the governor of New York decided he didn't like what Congress was doing? He could just arrest all of them. Can you imagine that? That's why having an independent federal district was so important in Washington. So the Congress says that you cannot be arrested or punished for any speech or debate you engage in the House. This is a very important provision because in Philadelphia or New York, the feds didn't have any protection. They were at the mercy of the states that were hosting them. Okay. Here we get to the taxes. How is Congress going to fund stuff? Well, bills for raising revenue, that's called a tax, right? Bills for raising revenue begin in the House. Why the House? It's the branch that's closest to the people. Okay. So what exactly is it that Congress does? They pass laws. Now, I'm sure everyone has seen the Schoolhouse Rocks video, how a bill becomes a law. Smile, yes, right? The process by which a bill becomes a law is a bill is proposed in one house, gets a majority vote. Proposed in the second house, gets a majority vote. Then the president signs it into law. Okay? Think about what has to happen for a bill to become a law. Think what has to happen. First, you have to elect all the people in the House for a majority of the people nationwide, and they agree to it. Then all the people in the Senate who are selected by the state legislatures, the states basically have to agree to it also. And then the president has the option of vetoing it. The veto can be overrode. There are so many gates and checkpoints, right, before a law can be enacted. And this was by design. It wasn't meant to be easy to pass laws. You have to have majorities of wide swaths of the American people and the executive himself before you can actually make something into a law. This is a very significant limitation. This wasn't the case that the king can just issue a decree here and issue an order there and say, here this, here that. We have a system of laws, not a rule of men. Indeed, you may have heard the expression, we have a rule of law, not a rule of men. This was a sentiment. It was actually incorporated into the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 by John Adams, that we have a rule of law and not a rule of men, that we have to have structure and process as a basis of our legal system. Without that, we are in a state of anarchy. So every bill passed the House and the Senate becomes presented to the president. And if he signs it, it becomes law. If he vetoes it, it doesn't. But then, this is revolutionary. When the King of England said no to Parliament, that was it. You could not override the king. But here, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate say, Mr. President, you know what? We disagree. It becomes law over the executive signature. We did not have a king. We had a president who was bound by law. The supreme judge of the world, as the Declaration said, is above the king or the president. Everyone is under the law. And this was a founding principle in which our government was drafted. So here we get, and I want you to flag in your constitutions, Article 1, Section 8. It's on page, someone has to shout it out. 23? 23. Put a little dog ear and put a big star next to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. We'll probably spend a quarter of the semester on these 2 pages of the Constitution, really, about 2 sentences, pages 23 and 24. Okay? And 25, top of 25. Just flag that in your notes. We have what's called a government of enumerated powers. What does that mean? Congress only has the power to do that which the Constitution gives them the power to do. The King of England could do whatever he wanted. Parliament could pass whatever law he wanted. The states, for the most part, could pass whatever laws they want. They have a police power. Congress does not have a police power. Congress only has those enumerated powers that the Constitution gives them. Article 1, Section 8 lists about 20 or so enumerated powers of what Congress can do. I want to walk you through these one at a time. Now, as I walk you through these, you'll say, wait a minute, Congress is a lot more stuff than that. Over time, through the courts, interpreting these phrases broadly, the federal government has expanded the scope of what they can accomplish. But let's stick with the text for a minute. We can bastardize it later. So it begins, the most important power of any government, to lay and collect taxes and pay debts for the common defense. Again, this was a power that wasn't clear in the Articles. Here, they can collect taxes directly onto people. If you want to purchase a carriage, Congress can tax the sale of that carriage. If you want to purchase whiskey, Congress can tax the sale of that whiskey. In fact, we almost had a civil war over a whiskey tax, like their alcohol. Another element, they can borrow money and establish credit. This is almost certainly an Alexander Hamilton line. In order to be an international nation, among others, they have to borrow money and have relations. In your Constitution, I want you to put a really huge star next to this one, the third clause. To regulate, it's on page 23. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. The power, Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. These, see, 5 or 6 words. These 5 or 6 words have been the basis for effectively the federal government's entire existence. Virtually everything the federal government has done in the last, 80 years or so, has been premised on this power to regulate commerce among the states. And the question becomes, what about commerce within a state? And that's for next week. Put a big star there. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization, that means immigration laws. We want Congress to decide who gets to enter, not individual states. This is indeed a point we'll discuss at various junctures this semester. To coin money. Believe it or not, the colonies and the states each had independent currency. You had a New York dollar, you had a Maryland dollar, you had a Delaware dollar. That was not very effective. The Constitution said we have a single form of currency which we use nationwide. And one of the first big debates was over the creation of a bank of the United States. We'll get there next week. To punish counterfeits, right? So if we're going to coin money, we can't let the states rip it off and make their own dollar bills. This is a useful one. We just got some property. Patents, copyrights, right? To actually promote science and useful arts and to create incentives for creation, the government would actually create property rights in form of a patent, right? This comes right from the Constitution. Okay? Here's another biggie, and put a star in your notes. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. A tribunal, of course, is a court. What does it mean to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court? Now, we haven't gotten there yet, but I'll give you a preview. The Constitution creates the Supreme Court of the United States. The Constitution creates it. Congress cannot get rid of the Supreme Court no matter how much they try. The Constitution does not create the lower courts. Right, we have courts here in Houston, we have courts in New Orleans, federal courts. Those are not created by the Constitution. Rather, Congress now has the power, if they so choose, to exercise that to create the inferior courts. Inferior means below. It doesn't mean that they're worse, but they're not quite as high up. In fact, lower court judges often get offended and say, oh, you're an inferior judge. So don't ever say that. Seriously. Piracy, still a problem, right? What happens if there's an offense at the high seas? Got to take care of the pirates. Captain Jack Sparrow will now be a federal felon. Okay? This is significant. Traditionally, the king, or perhaps the executive branch, raised the armies. Who are the armies loyal to? The king, the person paying their salary. Our Constitution divided that. Who raises the armies? Not the commander-in-chief, but the Congress. Who pays their salaries? Not the commander-in-chief, but the Congress. So for whatever reason we had a bad commander-in-chief, all Congress has to do is say, you know what? Your salary is good for 2 years. After that, you have no more salary. Good job raising an army with no money. This was such a significant provision that means nothing to us today, that it was not the commander-in-chief who were managing the armies and the Navy. It's the Congress. And they limit spending for 2 years at a time. That way the king can say, oh yeah, give me a 10-year war. No. Give you 2 years, come back for the next Congress and ask for more money. Make sure we still agree with this war. And in fact, that's one of the biggest checks that the Congress has, is the so-called power of the purse, that they can limit funding if the president's doing something stupid that they don't like. This clause respects the District of Columbia, which had not yet been created. But they said, listen, we need capital somewhere by ourselves, not in a state, an exclusive area where we control it, so we don't have to worry about being arrested. Okay. I want you to put a star next to the final clause. It's on page 25, the very top of the page. It says, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What does this mean? And I'll give you an easy example now. One of the powers of Congress is to create postal roads. Okay? Is there anything in the Constitution that says that Congress can buy wagons, or they can buy horses, or they can hire mailmen? Is there anything in the Constitution about that? No. But in order to have a postal service, it's necessary to have horses. It's necessary to have wagons. So at a minimum, what this clause was trying to do was to say, even if something is not expressly listed in the Constitution, we'll give Congress some flexibility. It's often called the elastic clause, like a rubber band, right? To allow the president to kind of do other stuff. This clause will be stretched very, very, very far. We'll read about this next week when we do McCulloch v. Maryland. But how far does this power stretch? You recall the Articles of Confederation said the president can only do that which was, under the Articles, Congress can only do that which was expressly delegated. Expressly delegated. Remember that part? This is the opposite. Even if something's not expressly delegated, if it can be implied, Congress can do it. Okay, we'll keep going. So that's in Article 1, Section 8. We'll probably spend 3 weeks in that one section. It's a big part for class. Article 1, Section 9 puts limitations on the states. You'll recall the Articles basically told the states nothing. The states could do whatever they wanted. Here, there were limits on the states. To return to the slavery issue, right? The migration or importation of such persons. That means the slave trade. So I want to dwell on this point for 1 second. The Constitution does not use the word slavery. The word slave appears nowhere. It says such persons and other persons. Any reasonably intelligent person would know what they're talking about. But there was a very deliberate effort by the framers not to put the word slavery in there. They did not want to lend a legitimacy to the idea of slavery. And in fact, a number of abolitionists, Frederick Douglass and Alexander Spooner, said, listen, the Constitution doesn't even say slavery. It can't be constitutional. They actually looked to the absence of that word. So it's actually very significant. Because they could have said all black persons. They could have said that, all slaves. They could have said that, but they chose not to. Okay? So it says the migration and importation of such persons shall not be prohibited until 1808. What does this mean? The slave trade, the horrible triangle trade where slaves were sent from Africa to the Caribbean to the North, and awful, awful stuff. Go watch Amadeus if you want to see about it. They put that on hold. They said, listen, this is probably going to be prohibited at some point. We can't do this now. Why? If they tried to prohibit the slave trade in 1787, we would not have had a union. We've had 13 separate states. They would fracture off. Said, listen, let's kick the can down the road 20 years, and maybe, hopefully, the members of Congress will have enough support in the North to repeal it. Indeed, that's what happened. So remember I said before, if the South had all this extra representation by counting blacks at 100%, they would have a monopoly? I've actually run the numbers on this. The slave trade was repealed in 1807, no, 1808 or 1809. Had the South had full representation for slaves, the 3/5 clause is what led the is what the slave trade. The 3/5 clause allowed the slave trade to be prohibited. It would not have been prohibited had the extra representation been there. So perversely, it had some salutary effect, as awful as it was. The other aspect is after the slave trade was prohibited, then you had the phenomenon, if you see the movie 12 Years a Slave, of basically kidnapping northern free slaves and bringing them down to the South. That was actually strikingly common, because since you can no longer import slaves, they were basically just capturing free blacks in the North. And that's a difficult movie to watch, but I encourage you to watch if you have the chance. Okay, what else? Habeas corpus. This is something which we won't talk much about, but generally speaking, if the executive branch captures you, you have to go to a court and say, here, judge, habeas corpus really means here's the body, right? Corpus Christi, here's the body. Bring the body to the court and persuade a judge why you're detaining the person. Okay. Well, I should talk about the bill of attainder later. Okay. No money shall be drawn from the treasury except in contents of appropriation. What's that mean? The president cannot spend money unless Congress tells him he can. Unless Congress passes a bill saying you can spend this money, the president cannot spend it. Again, the president has all this power, right? But unless he has a penny to pay anyone, he cannot do it. My favorite clause is no titles of nobility. You can't have any. We don't have any royalty. We'll never be royals, right? No royalty in the United States. No lords, as it were. Okay. Article 1, Section 10. A couple of you are laughing. Good. A couple of you are laughing. Okay. Article 1, Section 10 puts more limitations on the states. So if you recall, in the article, states were not allowed to form treaties with foreign nations. This is the same. States cannot form any sort of treaties, alliances, or confederation. So, as a side note, a lot of people said when the southern states seceded, it was unconstitutional because they formed a confederation. Unconstitutional. We'll get to that later. What else? States cannot coin money. We want a single national currency. We don't want these states making their own, paper money that's worthless. States can't impose a bill of attainder. What's a bill of attainder? Imagine if I pass a law saying, Josh Blackman shall be deported. Only Josh Blackman, no one else. There's been no court hearings. Congress simply passed that law. That would be a bill of attainder, singling out one person for criminal punishment. States can't pass ex post facto laws. What's an ex post facto law? Let's say I do something today, right? Let's say I drive 60 miles an hour today. And it's legal. Speed limit 65. And tomorrow the state says, you know what, speed limit's 50. And we're going to punish you because you broke the law. I'm like, wait a minute. When I drove, the speed limit was 65. It's like, well, we changed the law. No ex post facto. You can't punish someone for a law change after the fact. What's this business about contracts, right? A very common practice in the founding era was debt relief, right? Imagine this. You're a creditor. You give all these loans to people. They don't pay. So you try and collect it. What does the state do? The state passed a law saying you cannot collect the debt. We are canceling out the debt. Constitution says you can't do this. You cannot impair contracts. And again, states cannot grant titles of nobility. Good. Although there are Kentucky colonels. Colonel Sanders was actually a colonel in the military. He was a Kentucky colonel, which was an honorific title, although it's not quite nobility. All right, let's see what else. Okay. Okay, so that, 30 minutes in, that was just Article 1. That was just the structure of what Congress can do and what the states cannot do. We turn now to Article 2. Okay, Article 2 begins on page 27. Article 2 of the Constitution defines the executive. So whereas the Article 1 has very specific processes for how the Congress works, Article 2 is much more vague. So I want you to compare and contrast. Go to page, flip between 17 and 27, just in your books. 17 and 27. And if those are in your textbooks, just use the Constitution. It's easier. 17 and 27, okay? Article 1, Section 1, put a big star here. All legislative powers herein granted, okay? All legislative powers herein granted. Congress only has the powers that are granted here, right? Those things listed like commerce and tax, they can do that. Compare that with Article 2, Section 1. The executive power shall be vested in the president. Does it say the executive power is listed here? Does it say the executive power is herein granted? No. It says the executive powers, period. So Congress is a body of enumerated powers. The only other powers that are listed. In contrast, the president, there's only one, and he has this thing called the executive power. What is the executive power? We'll spend a couple weeks on that question. But it does not list with specificity what Congress can and cannot do. So we begin. There's only one president. Believe it or not, there were actually proposals to have 3 presidents. That didn't turn out so well in most of the places it's been tried, Rome and otherwise. So we had an executive power vested, or vested means given to, one president. One president. And this was not a king for life. This was not a monarch for life. 4-year term. And at each juncture, he would have to be elected. And elected not just by the states, not just by the people, but by electors in the states. This is the so-called electoral college. The idea was that people vote, they're not voting for the president directly. They're voting for the electors. Now, what's the difference, right? If I vote for an elector, won't they vote anyway? No. What if the people vote for a tyrant? The electors, with their own sense of decency, say, you know what? I'm not going to vote for that guy. I'm going to vote for someone else. At every juncture, our Constitution evinces a distrust of people. We do not have a direct democracy. People say, oh, America's a democracy. No, it is not. Rubbish. We have a republic. A republic with guards against mob rule. Right? A majority of Congress can't do anything without the Senate. The president can't do anything without both houses of Congress. Even if the people, even if someone wins the majority of the population, Al Gore, for example, if he doesn't win the electoral college, he's not president. Our system is meant to not allow majorities to rule just because they're majorities. That's a theme that's difficult if people are raising. We have a democracy. No, we don't vote on stuff, right? Maybe in the states we do, but we can't vote in acts of Congress. We vote for members who go to Washington and hopefully represent us. This entire passage discusses the things. So one interesting note, today we have presidential tickets, right? You know, Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, they run together as one unit. That was not the case under the original Constitution. This is crazy. Who became president? The person with the most votes. Who became vice president? The person with the second most votes. So imagine if the runner-up, right? If you know Mitt Romney became Barack Obama's vice president. That was basically what we had. In the election of 1796, John Adams was president. Thomas Jefferson was vice president. Thomas Jefferson hated John Adams. They hated each other. They never talked to each other, and they were there together. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson won, and Aaron Burr was vice president. They hated each other. They hated each other. So fortunately, the 12th Amendment fixed that, and they said that you have the president and vice president run together, and we got rid of this runner-up deal, which never really worked out particularly well. Yep. Okay, it's a fairly lengthy process. We have one that's relevant today. So, no person, I've never actually had this be relevant while I've been teaching. No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the adoption of the Constitution. Right? When the Constitution was adopted, there weren't many citizens of the United States quite yet. Shall be president. Now, I'm sure you've seen the news. Our junior senator, Senator Ted Cruz, was born in Calgary. So how was he running for president? So the law was, at the time that Cruz ran, was at birth, because he had a mother who was a U.S. citizen, he was naturalized. He was naturalized at birth. This is being hotly contested by law professors, though I and most people agree that if you are a citizen at birth, you are a natural-born citizen, even if you're not in the continental United States. This is consistent with text and history, although I'm sure people will try to challenge this in court. Interestingly, John McCain was born in the Panama Canal Zone, on a military base in the Panama Canal Zone. So even though he wasn't in the physical territory of the United States, he was a citizen at birth because of the law in effect at the time, although this will certainly help litigation to try to stop Cruz. And the classic law school hypothetical is, what happens if you're born with a cesarean section? You're born through a C-section. Are you natural born or artificially born? So it's a law professor's favorite question, which I won't bore you with. Okay. What happens if the president gets sick? The duty devolves on the vice president, right? The vice president has basically no role other than taking the president's seat. There's really not much of a role for the president. John Nance Garner, who was FDR's vice president, said that the job isn't worth a bucket of spit, which is a pretty good description. Okay. President gets a salary from the Treasury, and the president's salary can't be increased or decreased. This is actually a big deal. What happens if Congress just turns off the president's salary? It can't be very effective. The Constitution spells out the president's oath of office. I will faithfully execute the oath of office. I will solemnly swear. And as a tradition, every president who has taken this oath since George Washington has said at the end, "So help me God." At the very end, George Washington swore over a Bible. And if you go to Mount Vernon, you can actually see that Bible in Virginia, which was his home. Okay, Article 2, Section 2. This spells out the president's powers. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now remember, who raises the army? Congress. Who pays for the army? Congress. Who controls the army? The president. But unless Congress declares war, the president does not have the power to engage in. Now, that's actually not correct, right? It's commonly taught, and I think it's wrong, that unless Congress declares war, the president can't engage in it. That's probably wrong as a matter of history. Declaring war was like a state of declaration. It just recognized what was happening. But the president had independent powers to engage in military conflicts. But under the current Supreme Court understanding, the president needs Congress to declare war. That's probably not right, but we'll discuss this later. You'll learn a lot of things in this class that were totally wrong, but actually indeed are right. So this section spells out the interaction between the president and the Senate. Can the president make treaties with foreign nations unilaterally? No. He needs 2/3 of the Senate to consent. So if the president wants to engage in a climate treaty with France, he has to go through the Congress, and the Senate has to vote 2/3. What if the president wants to appoint an ambassador to France? Can he do it himself? No. The Senate must agree. This is why our foreign diplomats still must be suitable to the Senate. What if the president wants to appoint a judge to the Supreme Court? You need a majority of the Senate to vote for it. So at every single juncture, Congress checks the president's capabilities. Unless Congress confirms, or confirms means approves or concurs with the president's choices, he can't have a government. So imagine that Congress blocks all the president's appointments. That would not go very far. We just had one of these the other day. The president gives a State of the Union. Today it's his large televised address, although originally it was a written statement. Jefferson refused to announce something with just a letter to Congress. That's how Jefferson complied with the State of the Union. Okay. We'll spend a lot of time this semester on this sentence, which frankly has not been litigated ever, but has become very relevant in the last, 3 or 4 years. The president shall take care that their laws are faithfully executed. What does that mean? At a minimum, the president has a duty to enforce the laws. What happens if the president decides, you know what, I don't like that statute. I'm just not going to enforce it. I don't like the immigration law. I don't like that marijuana law. I don't like that Obamacare law. I'm just not going to enforce it. Is that constitutional? Well, we'll discuss this. This is actually a very live issue. Article 2, Section 4, the president can be removed from office on impeachment. Even the president himself can be tossed out of office. Okay, that's Article 2. If you notice, it's a lot shorter than Article 1. There's a lot less stuff, and leaves a lot more that's open to interpretation, shall we say. We'll spend several days on the scope of Article 2. But the separation of powers is a tough topic. Okay? We move on to Article 3 of the Constitution on page 31. Article 3 of the Constitution spells out the judicial power. The judicial power. Recall, the Articles of Confederation had no judicial power. They had the stupid pirates' court, right? That's all they had. The Constitution says, Article 3, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. There's a lot of stuff going on there. In one sentence, this Supreme Court of the United States was created. The Constitution creates a Supreme Court, not Congress. And what power does the Supreme Court have? The judicial power. What is the judicial power? The Constitution does not say what the judicial power is. It does include the power of judicial review. It does include the power to review decisions of state Supreme Courts. It does include the power to invalidate acts of Congress. It says judicial power. We'll discuss Marbury v. Madison, a case which I'm sure you study but don't understand, next week. You don't. I hope if you do, awesome, but probably don't. But this gives the judicial power to the Supreme Court. Who else gets this judicial power? The inferior courts. Remember those inferior judges, right? The inferiority complex, right? The lower courts that Congress can may time to time ordain and establish. So basically, the Constitution says, Congress, you guys have to build, a judicial system. We're not going to worry about it here. One of the first acts of Congress, one of the very first, was the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the court system. So the very first thing Congress did when they met was to create a court system. That's how important courts were. They were all lawyers. They understood. And it would be the Judiciary Act of 1789 that gave rise to Marbury versus Madison, which we'll discuss next week. Now, unlike in the Declaration of Independence, where the judges were dependent on the king for their salary, the judges of all courts hold their offices during good behavior. So long as they do their job and they're not screwing up, they have their job. And their compensation shall not be diminished. You cannot decrease the compensation of judges. Whereas in England, a judge that didn't follow the king's will had his salary slashed, here our judges were independent. They were neutral. They were not dependent on Congress to pay them more money. The flip side to this is they don't get raises. And judges often complained about this, that Congress never gives them a raise. They've actually had to litigate this. Judges have sued the Congress to try and get raises, cost of living adjustment, other things. But the salaries don't rise with inflation, if you will. So this was a very important provision of saying there's an independent judiciary for our new nation. So what exactly is this judicial power? And we'll study this more next week, but in short, the judicial power extends to certain cases and controversies, right? Where there's various matters affecting federal interests, you can go to a federal court. I'm sure you studied this in civil procedure. Why do we have diversity jurisdiction, right? Because you don't trust the local courts against out-of-staters. Where does this come from? It comes from right here, right? To controversies between citizens of different states. Everyone see this? Whenever it was a 1331, right? Where does diversity jurisdiction come from? Constitution. Between citizens of different states. That's where it comes from. And the only reason why federal courts can exercise diversity jurisdiction is because the Constitution says so. Okay. As well, cases affecting ambassadors. We'll come back to this when we do Marbury, but make sure you read this passage very carefully when we study Marbury. It's actually very tricky. Okay, we trial by jury, treason, good time, half hour left. Okay. You've seen this before, full faith and credit. This was a phrase in the Articles of Confederation. If you have a judgment in one state it has effect in a second state. Section 2 of Article 4. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to the privileges and immunities. Remember I told you privileges and immunities refer to certain rights and liberties, right? So if you were in Maryland and you moved to New Jersey cannot discriminate against you. But notice it says the citizens. That excludes slaves. And in fact, one of the cases we'll study later was some states actually purported to grant citizenship to slaves and said, look, they're slaves. They get these privileges and immunities. This actually gave way to Dred Scott. Believe it or not, this one sentence led to Dred Scott, and I'll explain why later, but it's a very significant provision in the Constitution that no one pays attention to anymore. It was a very important point. You've seen these provisions before. A person held to service or labor. That means a slave. Again, they don't use the word slavery. If he escapes, he shall be delivered. So if a slave escapes from Maryland, the slave state, to Pennsylvania, a free state, Pennsylvania is required to return them. And there was actually a law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed pursuant to this provision of the Constitution, which was challenged in court, and we'll get there later. I'm saying, if you notice, I haven't mentioned much case law today. Everything we'll do in common law after today is about cases, but I want you to actually look at the text first, not cases. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. They're not always right. They're not. Oh, you'll learn that in this class. They're very often not right. There's a provision by which new states can be admitted, okay, to the Union. So, does anyone know how West Virginia was formed? That's interesting history. During the Civil War, Virginia seceded. But there was a chunk of Virginia, kind of in the northern part, that didn't want to secede. So Congress said, Mazel tov, you're a new state, West Virginia, right? They basically carved out a chunk of Virginia and made it into a new state. Did Virginia consent? No. So technically, West Virginia is probably unconstitutional. It's probably not a real state, but we've moved beyond that enough that we can welcome them to the Union. But there's a decent argument that they're not a real state because they were not formed with the consent of the legislature. And here he comes. We do not have a democracy. We have a Republican form of government. How many people knew that was in the Constitution? Now, this is not like John McCain and Mitt Romney Republican. This refers to a representative form of government. We have a Republican Constitution, and the government of the United States guarantees a state this Republican form of government. It's guaranteed to us in the Constitution. Okay? The framers, though, recognized that the Constitution was not complete. It was not complete. And they provided a method by which it could be amended. Article 5 of the Constitution, and you may have actually been hearing about this in news recently, Article 5 of the Constitution allows different paths by which the Constitution can be changed. So you recall under the Articles of Confederation, you needed unanimous consent to change the Constitution, change the articles. Our process is not so strict. So there are two paths to start a constitutional amendment, two paths. First, if 2/3 of each house, 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate vote that we should amend the Constitution, the case is sent to the states. And 3/4 of the states in convention need to ratify it. So think about that. You need 2/3 of House Representatives, 2/3 of Congress, and then 3/4 of the states. That's a lot of people signing off. It was not easy to amend the Constitution. It was not meant to be easy to amend the Constitution. The Constitution was meant to be very difficult to amend, and that's why after 200 years we have 27 amendments. Go look at the Texas Constitution, probably hundreds or thousands of amendments. Go look at a European Constitution, there are thousands of amendments, right? We have 27. But there's a second path, which has actually been in the news recently. So last week, Governor Abbott released a plan called the Texas Plan, where the states should call for a constitutional convention. So not only can 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of Congress start an amendment process, but if 2/3 of the states, which is about 34 states today, so if 34 states decide to have an amendment process, we can start a convention without Congress. And then if 3/4 of the states agree, those amendments are added to the Constitution. Governor Abbott proposed about 9 or 10 amendments that could be proposed. It's not insane. I think it's actually conceivable that we actually may hit 2/3 of the states to agree to a convention. I don't think we get to 3/4. I think we actually may get to 2/3. I don't think we get to 3/4, but keep an eye on that. It's interesting to watch. Although, interestingly, What could not be changed? This 1808 business. The slave trade cannot be prohibited until 1808. They realized that amendment process can be used to limit the slave trade. Wait 20 years, see what happens. Yeah. We move on to Article 6, discussing debts, which people don't care much about. This is a big important clause. We'll spend a lot of time on this one. The Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. The Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. What does that mean? An act of Congress that conflicts with an act of the state government. Which one wins? The act of Congress. That federal law trumps state law. This is reverting the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, states do what they want. But here, Congress can control, to some extent, which laws are enacted. And you want to know why? Judges in every state are bound by it. This is how it's enforced. This is how it's enforced. It's not enough to say that federal law trumps state law, but the state judges are bound to interpret it that way. So as long as we have a judicial system, the state courts will impose a check on the legislatures. This is called the Supremacy Clause, and it's probably the most important sentence in the Constitution, because without this sentence, nothing else matters. Not much else matters. Indeed, every state official takes an oath to the Constitution. Every state official must take an oath to the Constitution, so they are too bound by this requirement. Okay. Article 7. This is the illegal part of the Constitution. Recall I said about an hour ago that the Articles of Confederation said you need all 13 states to amend it, right? All 13 states. How many to ratify the Constitution? 9. What about those other stragglers, right? What about, the states that don't want? They're bound. Even if states didn't concur, they were basically screwed. The articles went away. Now, eventually, all 13 states ratified. It happened, right? But there was no guarantee. In fact, many states didn't want this. Many states opposed the Constitution. Indeed, one of the reasons why a number of states opposed the Constitution was because it lacked a Bill of Rights. It lacked a list of protection of rights. Now, I've discussed with you the reason why this Constitution was drafted was to have structure protect freedom. I'll give you a very easy example. The Constitution was ratified in 1789. There was no free speech protection, none, right? In 1789, could Congress pass a law prohibiting newspapers that criticize the government? Well, you might say, well, there's no free speech protection. Of course Congress can pass that law. But that makes a very big mistake. Where does Congress get the power to regulate newspapers? In Article 1, Section 8, is there anything saying Congress can regulate newspapers? No. They can regulate commerce, but that's not a newspaper. So under the original design of the Constitution, because they had enumerated powers, because they could not do stuff, it wasn't necessary to expressly protect that. In other words, because Congress didn't have an explicit power to regulate newspapers, there's no need to have a freedom of the press. Well, this argument won the day in 1789, but there was an understanding that within a couple years, they needed to propose amendments. So in 1789, virtually right after the Constitution was ratified, Congress proposed 12 amendments to the Constitution. 12 amendments. I thought there were 10 amendments. Well, 2 of them never made it past point A, right? The first 2 amendments, actually, if you turn in your Constitution, page 58. Page 58. We have here the 27th Amendment, okay? If you read the footnote 30, right? The 27th Amendment was ratified in 1992. 1992. I'm assuming all of you are alive or no? No, some of you weren't? It'll happen eventually. I was actually recently talking to some guy, and I was trying to give him a Constitution. He's like, oh, I don't need that. I read that in high school. I was like, what year did you go to high school? He's like, 1988. I'm like, take a Constitution. He says, your Constitution was not completed yet, 1988. So the amendment was ratified in 1992. When was it proposed? 1789. Among the first 12 amendments that James Madison and the Continental and the Congress proposed was this provision that limits congressional pay. It took 200 years for them to ratify the damn thing. 200 years. And then finally, in 1792, Michigan came around. Michigan wasn't a state in 1791. Okay? But initially, there were 12 amendments proposed, 10 of which made them through. So people say, oh, the First Amendment's first because it's the most important. It was actually the Third Amendment. Free speech came third. The stupid thing about congressional pay came before free speech. The other one had to do with the size of districts that never went anywhere. So in my remaining 20 minutes, I'm making very good time, I want to walk you through the 27 amendments of the Constitution. We will cover the First Amendment in the last 2 weeks of class. I'll cover the Second Amendment briefly at a few junctures. You'll do the 4th, 5th, and 6th in other classes, but I wanted to walk through all of them because you may never, ever, ever cite them in the rest of your career. So the First Amendment, which again was the Third Amendment, provides a series of guarantees, so-called 5 freedoms, okay? If you'll notice, the word separation of church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. This is a concept that came from a letter by Thomas Jefferson. We have no separation of church and state. That's not there. All it says is Congress shall make no law. Now, if I had asked any of you, what does the First Amendment do? You say, oh, it gives us the right of free speech. Oh, it gives us the right of free religion. Wrong. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights does not give us rights. It's a misnomer. Let me say that again. The Constitution does not give us rights. What does it do? It places limits on government. The Constitution imposes limits on government. Look what it says. Congress shall make the law respecting the establishment of religion. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Does the Constitution say you have the right of free speech? No. It says that Congress can't limit it. And that's a very important distinction that postmodern law students cannot get. Our rights do not come from government. We start off in the Declaration of Independence. These rights are inalienable. We're endowed by our Creator. Those that framed the Constitution believe that certain of these rights were God-given, or they were natural rights, or they came from common law, wherever you want to call them. These rights predate government. Before we had a First Amendment, we had a right of free speech. Before we had a Second Amendment, we had a right of self-defense. These rights predated government. And the framing of the amendments shall make no law about religion, exercise, speech, press, assembly. This is imposing limits on the government. Calling it a Bill of Rights is actually a misnomer. It's really a Bill of Limitations, if you will. The Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Again, shall not be infringed. It's not saying you have the right to have a gun. It's saying that the government can't limit it. Okay? The Third Amendment, derived directly from the Declaration. Congress can't quarter troops. Right? Congress can't make you have troops quartered, but in time of a war, they can. This is the part people don't ever get. If it's actually a time of war, they can make you have a troop. So it wasn't that quite broad. The Fourth Amendment, which I'm sure you'll study in criminal procedure, or whenever you take that, is a warrant requirement. The police want to search your stuff, they need a warrant. This was, again, a direct response to the British system where you had these tax officers, these hither swarms of officers who could search your stuff without any papers at any court and look through your stuff. This is a protection of the Constitution for our rights of privacy. Warrants only issued on probable cause. Fifth Amendment has quite a number of guarantees. One is the grand jury. You may not know what this is. In most states and the federal government, if they want to try you for a crime, they need to persuade a group of your people, a grand jury, to actually hear the case. In other words, a prosecutor can't just throw you in jail right away. They need a jury of your peers to agree that the case can go forward. We've all heard of double jeopardy. That's in the Fifth Amendment. The government cannot try you twice for the same crime. Although, interestingly, the federal government and the state government can try you for the same crime because they're different sovereigns. Okay? You can't be forced to be a witness against yourself. That's a principle of self-incrimination. This is in basis why we have a Miranda right. You know, shut up, don't talk to the police. Everyone knows, never talk to the police, ever, ever, ever. Always have a lawyer present. They're not trying to help you. If they're talking to you, you're already in trouble. Never talk to the police, ever. And if you have any sisters or brothers or younger friends and they're teenagers, don't ask for their parents, ask for a lawyer. This is actually important. People say, oh, would you like your parents to be here? Worst example. Because parents say, tell the officer what you did, honey. No, 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 no. You want a lawyer who can represent you. Your parents not represent you. Let your parents beat you up and discipline you later. Talk to a lawyer. I give this shtick in a high school once, and she wanted to kill me. She was like, what are you doing? Like, never trust your teacher either. Talk to a lawyer. Your teacher does not have your interest at heart at all. As attorneys, your only interest is you. You are the client. That's it. Always talk to a lawyer. Talk to a lawyer. This one's a big one. We are now actually, we're not anymore. We were in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Magna Carta, this great charter of English liberty, was released in 1215. I can't say the 800th anniversary anymore. But the idea is, if the government wants to take away your life, liberty, or property, they need to give you a process, right? You need some sort of hearing. The government can't arbitrarily take your stuff or kill you. There always has to be some sort of hearing or process or judicial oversight before your rights are deprived. And this, you'll say this in property 2. Private property cannot be taken for public use unless there's just compensation. They want to take your property, they got to pay up. Amendment number 6, which we'll study also in criminal procedure. You have the right to a speedy trial by an impartial jury. You'll recall that during the Declaration of Independence, people were sent abroad to be tried in England. A speedy trial with an impartial jury in the area where the crime was committed, and you have the assistance of counsel, lawyers, right? We are the only profession who is written into the Constitution, right? We have a constitutionally guaranteed job to provide counsel, so make sure you do it well, okay? 7th Amendment is one of the most idiosyncratic ones. It says, the right to trial by jury in all cases exceeding $20 shall be preserved. No, that is not indexed for inflation, right? So technically speaking, if you have a federal case, you can demand a jury if there's an amount in controversy of $20. Although, as I'm sure you know, the minimum amount of controversy now is $75,001 under the diversity statutes. Okay. 8th Amendment, which comes up very often whenever someone's about to get executed. Excessive bail should not be required, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Now, does the Constitution prohibit the death penalty? No. In fact, the Constitution says you can be deprived of your life with due process. They can kill you. They give you a trial. But the Supreme Court has read this provision to say that murder can be cruel and unusual. We will not discuss the death penalty much, but maybe we'll do it in a different class. 9th Amendment is an important one that people don't really care much about. It says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights should not be construed to deny or disparage other rights. So here's the risk of having a Bill of Rights. We just listed all these great things like liberty of speech and religion and guns and all other stuff, right? What about something else? What about a right to, I don't know, raise your family? What about a right to get married? What about a right to do whatever else? Does the Constitution say anything about that? No. The 9th Amendment is the expressio unius canon reversed. It says the mere fact that something's listed here doesn't mean you don't have it. That your body of rights exceeds the scope of what's listed here. The mere fact that we list these 1 through 8 things, you have more liberties than that. What are those rights? We'll get to that later. The 10th Amendment is a big one that people don't think about much anymore either. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it, are reserved to the states. So whatever powers are not given to the central government are retained by the states and the people. This is the basis for what's often known as federalism. We'll discuss this for a lot of time this semester. We're making good progress. Actually, I'm finished. The 11th Amendment. The 11th Amendment provides that says you can't sue your state. We'll explain why later. It's an obscure topic. We'll get there. The 12th Amendment changes how the president's elected, and as I said, allows a person, the vice president and the president to run together, not that you have the runner-up become the VP, because that was very poorly drafted idea. Okay. And then we have no amendments until after the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, we have 3 amendments in fairly rapid succession. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And if you open up your constitutions, it's on page 48. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, put a big star next to it. These are what's called the Reconstruction Amendments. These change the Constitution in radical ways that are far different than what the framers designed. The framers' design was that, well, you know what? Let's let the states, figure this stuff out for themselves, and hopefully they'll protect the rights of all their people. And the experience of slavery and the Civil War said, you know what? That didn't quite work. So what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did was re-alter the calculus. It said, we will give the central government much more authority over the states in matters of race. It vastly expanded the ability of the central government to protect people on the basis of their race. So the 13th Amendment says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. This prohibited slavery. But noticeably, it was not just prohibiting the government. To this point, everything in the Constitution says the states can't do this, Congress can't do this, the president can't do this. But here, slavery shall not exist. Slaves weren't owned by the states. They were owned by individuals. This was the first provision of the Constitution that directly limited what individual people could do. It was the first provision of the Constitution that controlled what individuals can do, saying, you, individual, you cannot own a slave. And you want to know what? If you have a slave, Congress can pass a law to throw your butt in jail. This gave Congress the power to enforce this article by legislation, saying if you were a slave owner, Congress can throw you in jail. Before this, Congress did not have the power to do so. The most significant amendment of the Constitution, and it's quite long, you'll find it on page 48, 49, and 50, is the 14th Amendment. And we will probably spend, oh my God, a month on this. So I'll only do a little summary now. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. What did this do? It immediately made all the slaves citizens. They were no longer dependent on the states for citizenship. The fact that they were born in the United States, they were now citizens. And with citizenship, they got the full panoply of rights, those privileges and immunities, right? So no state shall make or enforce the law which will the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. That sentence was meant to undo Dred Scott. These first two sentences undid Dred Scott. Africans, you are citizens, and you get all these privileges and immunities. You get all these rights, which the states cannot deprive you of. Big deal. Those two sentences. The remainder is what most people know about, but it actually wasn't that big of a deal back then. States cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or process, that due process of law, and states can't deny people the protection of the laws. Okay. We'll come back to protection due process later, but at the time, the big deal was the Privileges and Immunities Clause. That's why it came first. You can skip Section 2 for now and Section 3. And if you turn to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which is at the top of page 50, it says, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of the article. And you put a little star next to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, because we will spend a significant amount of time on Section 5. This is what gives Congress the power to enforce civil rights legislation. This is what gives Congress the authority to prohibit certain acts that are discriminatory. Okay? The 15th Amendment. This was the final of the Reconstruction Amendments. It said the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or servitude. If you notice, it did not say gender. The right to vote for women, suffrage, will not come to the 19th Amendment about 50 years later, or about 40 years later. And again, Section 2, Congress has the power to enforce this article. So, for example, the Voting Rights Act, which I'm sure you've read about, Congress gets its power from the 15th Amendment. And the rest of the amendments aren't nearly as consequential. So the 16th Amendment discusses the power of Congress to impose an income tax. Believe it or not, Congress tried to impose an income tax by statute. The Supreme Court said unconstitutional, you don't have the power to do it. So the American people ratified an income tax amendment. Imagine, we would actually vote for an income tax amendment, but that was a different time. The 17th Amendment was significant. It said the people of the states shall vote for Senate. No longer shall the senators be selected by the state legislatures. This, in large measure, took the states out of the federal calculus. Pros and cons, I don't quite know what I think about it, but it definitely altered how our federal system works. 18th Amendment. This is the one people hate, prohibition. Congress actually prohibited the importation and ratification of liquors within the United States. Okay? Fortunately, a few years later, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, but it was in effect for some time. Okay? The 19th Amendment, right, this is women's suffrage. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote irrespective of race. The 19th Amendment extended that to those irrespective of sex. And this was ratified in 1917, give or take, can't remember the year. Okay. The 20th Amendment. This actually changes the term of when the president begins his office. It used to be that the election was in November, and the new president came in March. That created this weird 3-month period where the old guy was like, what am I doing here? So they moved it up that on January 20th at noon, the president is sworn in. And that's why every January 20th, there's inauguration. A little bit of trivia. January 20th of 2013 was a Sunday. So President Obama actually was sworn in twice. He was sworn in on a Sunday in the White House. Chief Justice Roberts was there. And then a big party on the 21st on the Capitol lawn where everyone saw it. So he was actually sworn in. Real story, he was actually sworn in 4 times. So President Obama shares the record with President Roosevelt for 4 oaths of office. Why? In 2009, when he was being inaugurated, he and Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath. They talked over each other, and they kind of flubbed it. And people were actually worried that it didn't take. So the next day at the White House, Chief Justice Roberts administered the oath again. So Obama's had the oath 4 times. He's been elected twice. Okay. And then we go down to the... You notice the amendments get longer over time. The initial ones are very short. Almost done. I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to do this. So the 21st Amendment, marathon. The 21st Amendment, like a Gatorade shot or something. So the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition, and it says the 18th Amendment is repealed. In fact, in the District of Columbia, there's actually a bar called the 21st Amendment, which honors prohibition's repeal. In fact, every year on the anniversary of the amendment's ratification, people have the Prohibition Day where they drink more than usual, I suppose, or not at all. The 22nd Amendment is the FDR Amendment. It says no president should serve more than 2 terms in office. George Washington set the precedent of only running twice. Then Teddy Roosevelt tried, but he wasn't elected a 3rd time, and Franklin did it 4 times. So now that's constitutionally prohibited. Okay, the 23rd Amendment gives a vote, electoral vote to District of Columbia, which isn't really a state. The 24th Amendment was actually a voting rights amendment. It said there are no poll taxes. In other words, you can't charge people to vote. Indeed, this issue came up with the Texas voter ID law. People said making people pay for a driver's license to vote was a poll tax. The courts haven't quite embraced that argument. The 25th Amendment discusses what happens if the president gets sick or resigns. There's a very complicated process of what happens if the president becomes sick, because it's very hard to remove the president. This is like the Tom Clancy novels or 24, right? You read through this, and these are all the eventualities of what happens if the president can't discharge his powers. Almost there. The 26th Amendment, this is probably a mistake, I'm kidding, giving the right to vote to people at the age of 18. So this extended it further. In fact, in a lot of jurisdictions, they even allow 15 and 14-year-olds to vote for local elections. And that brings us to the 27th Amendment, with 3 minutes to spare. This amendment was first proposed in 1791. It says, no law varying the compensation for the service of senators should take effect until election. What does this mean? Congress can't give itself a raise. Anytime congressional pay is increased, it takes effect after the next election. And that is the Constitution, my friends. Thank you so much. You can clap. I don't care. All right. I'll see all of you on Tuesday. Thank you so much.